The Myth of the Solid Heavenly Dome, Part 1. We've been going through a couple of books on the Genesis account of origins, namely the Genesis creation account and its reverberations in the Old Testament, and He Spoke and It Was, Divine Creation in the Old Testament. Both of them edited by Gerald Klingbeil, both of them relatively recent, 2015. There's the covers of the two books. And we are currently in Chapter 2, beginning at the Myth of the Solid Heavenly Dome, another look at the Hebrew rāqîaḥ, by Randall, Younker, and Richard Davidson, both of Andrews University. The chapter starts out with the introduction. Anyone who wishes to study ancient Hebrew cosmology will quickly discover that the common understanding among the most modern biblical scholars is that the Hebrews had a pre-scientific, even naive view of the universe. And we were just treated to some people who wrote a book on that last week. This understanding is built around the idea that the Hebrew word rāqîaḥ, which appears in Genesis 1 and is usually translated firmament in English Bibles, was actually understood by the ancient Hebrews to be a solid hemispherical dome or vault that rested upon mountains or pillars that stood along the outermost perimeter of a circular flat disk, the earth. Above this solid dome was a celestial ocean, waters above the firmament. Attached to the dome and visible to observers below were the stars, sun, and moon. The dome also possessed windows or gates through which celestial waters above the firmament, could, upon occasion, pass. On the surface of the flat earth were terrestrial oceans, waters below the firmament, and dry land. Below the earth were subterranean waters, fountains of the deep, and the netherworld of the dead, Sheol. This understanding of Hebrew cosmology is so common that pictures of it are frequently found in Bible dictionaries and commentaries, and we saw one of those pictures last week. In fact, probably the most famous one, the one that always comes up. In support of this reconstruction of Hebrew cosmology, supporters bring two lines of argument to bear. The first is textual and linguistic. The context and meaning of certain words, such as rāqîaḥ, support this reconstruction. At least that's the claim. Second, this view was common to other peoples of the ancient Near East, especially in Mesopotamia, which was considered the probable source of Hebrew cosmology. Now notice that Hebrew cosmology differs from Mesopotamian cosmology rather strongly in certain areas, certain very central areas, theologically speaking, but somehow the Hebrews just took it over anyway. This understanding continued to be accepted, according to these people, throughout the early history of the Christian church in the Middle Ages. It was not, Reconstructionists argue, until the rise of modern science that it was finally recognized that the biblical view of cosmology was naive and untenable. In the book we had asked us to go back in our minds to before it was felt to be untenable so you could see what it was really like. At least that's their opinion. In this chapter that we're looking at now, we will examine these two arguments, looking first at the history of cosmological views of the ancient world and the early church in the Middle Ages. We will then look at how 19th and 20th century scholars viewed the cosmologies of these earlier periods. And that's what we will be doing this week. And then next week, we will conclude with a look at the Hebrew words and passages used by these scholars to reconstruct the so-called Hebrew cosmology. History of interpretation, I'm going to skip over that part of it. Babylonian views of the heavens during the latter part of the 19th century. Critical scholars commonly suggested that the ancient Hebrews borrowed many of their ideas, including the notion that the heaven was a solid hemisphere, from the Babylonians, probably while the former people were exiled there. So notice that this theory depends heavily upon the documentary hypothesis of the Pentateuch. And you see, that's the priestly document was considered late, at about the time of the exile, so it could have been influenced by the Babylonians. The idea that the Hebrews borrowed from the Babylonians was especially common during the pan-Babylonian craze that gripped biblical scholarship for a brief period during the early 20th century. That would be the 1900s, 1910, that era. Closer comparative analysis between Babylonian and Hebrew thought has, however, found so many significant differences between the two that the idea of direct borrowing has been virtually abandoned by subsequent scholarship. Still, after the foundations have been knocked out from under this idea, there have still been some who continue to suggest that the ancient Hebrews borrowed cosmological concepts, including the idea of a solid domed heaven from the Mesopotamians. However, even this idea had to be scuttled when more recent work by Wilfrid Lambert could find no evidence that the Mesopotamians believed in a hard-domed heaven. Rather, he traces this idea to Peter Jensen's mistranslation of the term for heavens in his translation of the Enuma Elish. Lambert's student, Wayne Horowitz, attempted to piece together a Mesopotamian chronology from a number of ancient documents, but it is quite different from anything found in the Hebrew Bible. Horowitz's studies suggest that the Mesopotamians believed in 6 flat heavens, suspended one above the other by cables. When it came to interpreting the stars in the heavens, the Mesopotamians were more interested in astrology, that is, what the gods were doing and what it meant for humanity, than they were in cosmology. They didn't really care how it got started or how it fit together. There is no evidence that the Mesopotamians ever believed in a solid heavenly vault. Notice that statement. And yet, the Hebrews borrowed the solid heavenly vault from the Mesopotamians who didn't have the concept. Greek views of the heavens, there is good evidence that as early as the 6th century BC, the ancient Greeks suggested that the heavens might consist of a series of hard spheres. However, this idea should not be confused with the solid vault or solid dome theory that was suggested by later biblical critics. The critics have envisioned only a hard, hollow hemisphere resembling half a sphere in the shape of an upside-down bowl. In reality, however, the Greeks argued for a spherical, not flat, earth that was suspended inside a complete hollow heavenly sphere, which in turn was also suspended inside additional outer spheres, a geocentric model. They believed that these spheres were necessary to explain the movement of the sun, moon, stars, and planets. It was thought that these celestial bodies were attached to or embedded in these large, transparent, and hard spheres, which carried the celestial bodies along as they rotated in space. A number of different spheres were needed to explain the separate movement of the celestial bodies, usually thought to be 8. The 7 planets plus sun being a planet, believe it or not, plus the sphere of the stars themselves. Generally, it was believed that there might be at least 8 such spheres nesting inside each other. The Greeks based the rotations of the spheres, and hence the celestial bodies, upon their own observations and upon the written records of the ancient Babylonians. Aristotle and Ptolemy provide the classic formulations of the Greek celestial sphere model that influenced all scholars of the early Christian church and the Middle Ages. Jewish views of the heavens, it was during the Hellenistic period that the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek. When the translators came to the Hebrew word rāqîaḥ, they chose to translate it with the word stereoma. The accent is on the epsilon there. Usually called stereoma in English because of its similarity to other words that we have. Something established or steadfast. This is not surprising in that the Hebrew text equates rāqîaḥ with shemayim, or heavens. The common belief about the heavens at that time, as with Greek views, was that they were solid. And of course, Greek views heavily influenced this. After all, they're translating the Bible into Greek. The idea of hard spheres would be picked up by Hellenized Jews as early as the 4th century BC. The pseudepigraphical work First Enoch discusses a hard firmament with openings through which the sun, moon, and planets move in and out. This work also describes coming to the ends of the earth as far as the heavens, whatever that means. However, there is some dispute about whether First Enoch is saying a person can touch the heavens at the end of the earth, or whether there is still a chasm that separates the earth from the heavens. The latter seems more likely. The former would support a domed earth, while the latter is in harmony with the Greek idea of the earth being suspended within a sphere. Another Jewish pseudepigraphical work, Third Baruch, recounts the story of men building the Tower of Babel to reach the heavens in order to see what it is made of. While some have suggested that this passage supports a dome theory, it can also be understood as simply as supporting the idea of a hard heaven as a sphere, which is not incompatible with the Greek celestial sphere model. Well, it is in one way. Ptolemy clearly says that as far as the distance from the earth to the sphere of the stars, the entire earth can be considered as a point, which means that the distance from the earth to the stars is orders of magnitude larger than the distance around the earth, which was known at that time to be about 24,000 miles. Given the prevailing Greek thought, the latter is more likely. Early Christianity in the heavens. Early Christians were following the discussions of the Greek philosophers with interest and speculated on how biblical teachings compared to the Greek understanding of the cosmos. They accepted the ideas that the earth was a spherical globe and that the biblical firmament was one of the celestial spheres. But they could not identify which sphere was the biblical firmament, so they tended to add a few spheres to reconcile the Bible with Greek thinking. Basil of Caesarea and Augustine are among the early church fathers who attempted to harmonize biblical teachings of the cosmos with Greek notions of the celestial spheres. This can be seen in Jerome's translation of the Bible into Latin. Jerome used the Greek Old Testament, the Septuagint, as one of his sources and was undoubtedly familiar with Greek discussions about the celestial spheres. Thus, when he came to the book of Genesis and saw the Greek word used for the Hebrew rāqîaḥ was stereoma, he selected the Latin firmamentum to convey the Greek sense of the word. It is from the Latin firmamentum that the word firmament, used to describe the heavens, came into common usage in English. It is important to note that the Latin firmamentum conveys the Greek concept of hard celestial spheres that was popular at the time. It should not be used to support the dome or vault theory, because the dome is only a half sphere. The dome theory, along with the idea of a flat earth, has been almost universally rejected by Christian scholars, both in the early Christian period and throughout the Middle Ages, with the notable exception of Lactantius and Cosmas Indicopleustus, who are always brought up at this point. It should also be noted that while Jerome's translation may be seen as support for the notion of hard celestial spheres, not all Christians accepted this position. Basil, for example, was inclined to believe in a fluid firmament, not a hard sphere. In the Hexameron, he wrote, "Not a firm or solid nature which has weight and resistance. It is not this that the word firmament means." We read the entire quote last week. Augustine, on the other hand, was not certain of the nature of the other Greek spheres nor of their composition. In some of his statements, he seems to argue that the firmament of Genesis must be a hard sphere since it held back the waters above. Yet elsewhere in the same essay, he spoke of air and fire as the material essence of the heavens, thereby suggesting soft and fluid heavens. And there's a whole discussion that is fascinating that you can read. I think it was Grant that wrote, and the references are in the book, the larger book, that talks about how you can have spheres that move while the spheres actually don't move. And the way you do that is you have them fluid so that the center moves and it gradually moves less and less until you get to the outside. Sort of like a stream that flows fast in the center and is stationary at the edges. This unwillingness to commit to a hard sphere theory is reflected in the common tendency by most Christian scholastics to translate the Hebrew rāqîaḥ as expansion or extension, rather than firmamentum. The former expressions all convey the meaning of expanse and do not commit one to an understanding of something hard. As Edward Grant, that's the gentleman whom I referred to, notes, most Christian authors and Latin encyclopedias during late antiquity thought of the heavens, that is the celestial spheres, as fiery or elemental in nature and therefore fluid. And those, by the way, are their ellipses, not mine. The late medieval Christianity in the heavens. The theory of celestial spheres continued to dominate Christian thinking about the cosmos throughout the Middle Ages. The existence of numerous hollow spheres or orbs around the spherical Earth was almost universally accepted. However, the actual nature of the spheres was an ongoing topic of debate. Were they hard, fluid, or soft? The debate was a theophilosophical issue determined by questions such as the following. It's very interesting to read the logic behind what they have to say. Were the hard spheres corruptible? If they have motion, then they are not perfect, because motion means moving from one state to another, and either the first state is not perfect or the second state is not perfect, otherwise they would stay the way they were. Would a perfect God make something corruptible? The obvious answer, no. How and in what way were these spheres congruent with the observations of various astronomers? So they did have some idea that experimental evidence was kind of important, but the philosophical questions dominated. During the 13th century, it seems more scholastics thought of the spheres as fluid. However, in the 14th century, there was a shift towards the majority viewing the celestial spheres as being hard. Between those two sentences, there's a whole bunch of research, much of it included in Grant's book. It seems this view is widespread among scholars of the 15th and 16th centuries as well, although there were also many for whom the precise nature of the composition did not matter. Probably the majority. Therefore, as in early antiquity, Christian, biblical, and Latin scholars of the early Middle Ages, even into the 13th century, did not view the heavens as hard or fiery. During the early part of this period, both prominent Jewish rabbis such as Abraham ben Ezra and David Kimchi, and Christian scholars of notoriety, including Thomas Aquinas and Durandus of San, pardon my French here. I'll take that. Preferred to translate rāqîaḥ as expanse. Renaissance views of the heavens, 16th to 17th centuries. Three key developments occurred in the late 16th and early 17th centuries that had significant implications for how the cosmos was viewed. First, the observations by Tycho Brahe of a supernova in 1572 and the discovery of the Great Comet in 1577 seemed to defy the hard sphere theory. Basically, one, you had a new star that came and went, and that was obviously change from not being there to being there, then to not being there. The heavens were corruptible, to use the philosophical phrase. And the second one is the Great Comet of 1577 appeared to be going out past the Earth. They used to think that comets were all close enough to us that they were below the sphere of the moon. I don't want to say orbit because they weren't thinking in terms of orbits. But the idea is that this comet appeared to be out past the moon, and that meant that something that came and went and was corruptible was actually in the heavens themselves. So the philosophy of holding that the heavens are incorruptible started to take pretty much of a death blow. Second, the championing of Copernicus's heliocentric model by Galileo allowed for the possibility of intersecting planetary orbits. Interestingly, although Copernicus's heliocentric model called for a different configuration of the celestial spheres, he still thought the spheres were hard, as did Galileo, and as did many people. As a matter of fact, you'll find people arguing against Newton's theory of gravitation with the idea that the planets are carried along by vortexes, whatever the vortexes were. Because something must be making them move, because things didn't naturally move by themselves. The concept of inertia and getting an object moving and it just keeping on moving until you stopped it somehow or changed it deliberately was not a concept that was flowed naturally from Aristotle. Nevertheless, the work of Brahe, Copernicus, and Galileo all contributed to the eventual rejection of the hard sphere theory. Thus, by the late 17th and during the 18th centuries, the idea of hard spheres, which had been popular for 300 years, was virtually abandoned. Emphasis was again on the notion of soft spheres, and with the advent of Newton, there were no even hard soft spheres. In terms of biblical hermeneutics, however, the Galileo affair led to a third, unheralded yet significant development. An essay promoting accommodationism written by the Benedictine scholar Antoine Augustin Calmet. I think I have that one right. Calmet had been asked by the church to write an introduction to Galileo's dialogue on the two chief world systems that would set a proper distance between the church's position and that of Galileo. Calmet was not supposed to endorse Galileo's position. However, he was apparently sympathetic to Galileo's claims and proposed an accommodationist interpretation of the creation account that suggested that the inspired writer, in deference to the lack of knowledge on the part of his audience, the ancient Jews, used languages and ideas that would be more easily understood by them, which most of us actually would find sort of reasonable. Thus the heavens, but this is his conclusion, thus the heavens were described as a tent-like heavenly vault, perhaps the earliest such claim in which a non-literal accommodationism hermeneutic was applied. Calmet's ideas would be picked up and promoted by Voltaire. Although a direct connection cannot be at present be established, Calmet's ideas of what the ancient Jews thought about the cosmos would be very similar to those promoted by 19th century biblical criticism. And of course, it's a very short step from saying he accommodated his speech to the people who really didn't understand to saying he didn't understand either and God accommodated his speech, and then pretty soon what God says really well, it wasn't God, and so God didn't understand either. Meanwhile, the translation of rāqîaḥ as expanse was almost universal among biblical scholars during the 16th and 17th centuries. For example, this idea was reflected in the work of the Dominican Santis Pagnino, one of the leading philologists and biblicists of his day, who was known for his literal adherence to the Hebrew text of Scripture. In his Veteris et Novae Testamenti Nova Translatio, Old and New Testament's new translation, he consistently translated rāqîaḥ as expansionism. 18th and 19th century views of the heavens. Biblical scholars of the 18th century, including Sigmund Jakob Baumgarten and Romanus Teller, continue to endorse expansionism as the best translation of rāqîaḥ. An important application of this understanding is found in the Mosaic theory of the solar or planetary system, in which Samuel Pye defined the firmament as an expanse or atmosphere of fluid. Significantly, he extended this notion to also include the other planets in the system. There are many examples from the 19th century that maintain this interpretation of rāqîaḥ. The British Methodist theologian Adam Clarke, who's one of our interestingly favorite biblical commentators outside of the Adventist Church, who produced Clarke's Bible commentary in 1831, argued that earlier translators, by following the firmamentum of the Vulgate, which is a translation of stereoma of the Septuagint, have deprived this passage of all sense and meaning. And it's a pretty strong criticism of that. Similarly, John Murray, a Scottish scholar with a PhD in chemistry, retold his expertise in ancient history and languages, including Hebrew, in the truth of revelation demonstrated by an appeal to existing monuments, scriptures, gems, coins, and metals, to argue that the firmament was a permanently elastic substance consisting of a mixture of gaseous matter and vapor that attracted water above it, which was in line with the cosmologic views of the time. Not only were his views in line with the current thinking of his time, but the Truth of Revelation became one of the early books in the emerging biblical archaeology genre. The 19th century biblical criticism and the origin of the flat earth and solid dome theory. As we moved the discussion into the developments of the 19th century, it is important to note two interesting and significant works on the history of science. Historians Jeffrey Burton Russell and Christine Garwood, respectively, debunked the long-held view among modern scholars that ancient philosophers and scientists of the early church, late antiquity, and the Middle Ages believed the earth was flat. And this is actually quite easy to do if you just read the people back then. After an extensive review of the letters, papers, and books of the major thinkers who wrote during these periods, Russell and Garwood made the surprising discovery that apart from a few isolated individuals, no one believed in a flat earth. Indeed, the common consensus throughout this entire period among virtually all scholars and churchmen was that the earth was spherical. Where then did the flat earth understanding of the early Christians and medieval thought originate? They were able to trace its origin to the early 19th century, when anti-religious sentiment was high among many scholars and intellectuals. And this is note 38, and I think it's worth looking at. In a lecture at Westmont College for the American Scientific Affiliation in 1997, in which he addressed the themes of his book, Jeffrey Burton Russell argued that the reason for promoting both the specific lie about the sphericity of the earth and the general lie that religion and science are a natural and eternal conflict in Western society is to defend Darwinism. The answer is really only slightly more complicated than that bald statement. The flat earth lie was ammunition against the creationists. The argument was simple and powerful, if not elegant. Look how stupid these Christians are. They are always getting in the way of science and progress. These people who deny evolution today are exactly the sort of people, same sort of people, as those idiots who for at least 1,000 years denied that the earth was round. How stupid can you get? And it's interesting because this is actually, accessible online. The book actually has the web reference. Scholarly references are changing permanently, interestingly enough. But this was a lecture to the American Scientific Affiliation, which is, if I can put it politely, not known for its conservative biblical scholarship. This is not to say that before this there were not skeptics who believed in a flat earth and domed heaven theory. In fact, this view starts to emerge in the 17th and 18th centuries. We've already made reference to the significant essays of Calmet. Voltaire also promoted this idea in his article Ciel matériel, heaven, in the Dictionnaire philosophique, in which he wrote the following about the ancient Hebrews' view of the cosmos. These childish and savage populations imagine the earth to be flat, supported I know not how, just making up, by its own weight in the air. The sun, moon, and stars to move continually upon a solid vaulted roof called a firmament, and this roof to sustain waters and have floodgates at regular distances through which these waters issued to moisten and fertilize the earth. However, this was not a widespread view and did not gain a consensus among critical biblical scholars until the 19th century. According to Russell and Garwood, two of the key individuals who helped introduce and popularize the flat earth myth in the 19th century scholarship were the American author Washington Irving and the Egyptologist Antoine-Jean Letron. Irving, in The Life and Voyages of Christopher Columbus in 1828, invented the indelible picture of the young Columbus, a simple mariner appearing before a dark crowd of benighted inquisitors and hooded theologians at a council in Salamanca, all of whom believed that the earth was flat like a plate. That's, by the way, the year of George Washington and the cherry tree. Latran, who was known for his strong anti-religious prejudices, cleverly drew upon both his studies in geography and patristics to misrepresent the church fathers and their medieval successors as believing in a flat earth in his Des Opinions cosmographiques des Pères de l'Église. I'll do it in English. On the cosmographical ideas of the church fathers, 1834. In particular, Russell's debunking of the flat earth myth is significant for understanding the widely held view among biblical scholars that ancient peoples believed that the sky or heaven among them was a metal vault. This attribution to the ancients of the solid sky or solid dome concept appears in Western literature at about the same time as the flat earth myth. The idea of a flat earth becomes an integral component in the reconstruction of the metal sky or metal dome cosmology, in which the hemispherical dome necessarily rests or is anchored on a flat earth. Thus it appears that the biblical critics of the 1850s built their ideas about ancient Hebrew cosmology upon the incorrect flat earth concept of 20 years earlier. Further, they seem to have confused ancient and medieval discussions of hard celestial spheres with the hemispherical solid dome or solid vault and flat earth myths, which were two, I wouldn't say quite unrelated concepts, but I would say they're distinct, clearly distinct concepts. The flat earth myth was widely endorsed by critical biblical scholars during the middle of the 19th century, so it became the received wisdom. At this time, a number of publications emerged that proposed the Bible contained naive views of the cosmos, including the idea that the earth was a firmament, the idea that the firmament was a hard dome. One of the earliest suggestions of this nature was by John Pye Smith in 1839. This is a quote. Examining the whole subject by connecting it with some passages which have been quoted and some yet to be mentioned, we acquire the idea of the meteorology of the Hebrews. They supposed that, at a moderate distance above the flight of birds, was a soft, solid concave hemisphere, a kind of dome, transparent, in which the stars were fixed as lamps, and containing openings to be used or closed as was necessary. It was understood as supporting a kind of celestial ocean called the waters above the firmaments and the waters above the heavens. Other biblical scholars soon picked up on this flat earth and domed heaven cosmology. Among the better-known scholars was Taylor Lewis, a professor of Greek and instructor in the Oriental tongue, and a lecturer on biblical and Oriental literature at Union College, whose ideas were made popular in his book, The 6 Days of Creation. Likewise, Charles Wycliffe Goodwin, an Egyptologist, argued in a chapter titled Mosaic Cosmogony in the 1860 edition of Essays and Reviews that the biblical writer believed in a hard-domed heaven. Concerning rāqîaḥ, he wrote, "It has been pretended that the word rāqîaḥ may be translated expanse so as to merely mean empty space. The context sufficiently rebuts this." How's that for a definitive argument? Andrews Norton, an American Unitarian preacher and theologian who taught at Bowdoin and Harvard, pointed out the naivety of the Bible in his book, The Pentateuch, and its relation to the Jewish and Christian dispensations, declaring that the blue vault of heaven is a solid firmament, separating the waters which are above it from the waters on the earth, and that in this firmament the heavenly bodies are placed. Also influential was John William Colenso, an Anglican bishop to Natal, who commented, and we quoted this last week as well, "If it would be wrong for a Christian missionary of our day to enforce the dogma of the church in former ages, which we now know to be absurd," which we now know not to have been the dogma at that time, but never mind, and to mislead a class of native catechists by teaching them that the earth is flat and the sky a solid firmament above which the stores of rain are treasured, when God has taught us otherwise, it must be equally wrong and sinful to teach them that the scripture stories of the creation, the fall, and the deluge are infallible records of historical fact, if God, by the discovery of science in our day, has taught us to know that these narratives, whatever they may be, are certainly not to be regarded as history. You can see the argument that's being made directly from the half-dome firmament to the idea that we need to take the first chapters of Genesis with several grains of salt. By this time, the flat earth and domed heaven cosmology was accepted by both biblical geologists and mainstream historical critical biblical scholars, in spite of vocal resistance by more conservative and evangelical scholars. Modern advocates of a flat earth and vaulted heaven Hebrew cosmology, in spite of vigorous opposition to the vault theory by more conservative biblical scholars and the demise of Pan-Babylonianism, the idea that the ancient Babylonians and Hebrews believed in a hard hemispherical dome continued to be pushed. Harry Emerson Fosdick, some of you will have run into him, was an influential advocate and popularizer during the 1930s, who, like most liberal commentators, continued to accept the view of a naive Hebrew cosmology without really providing careful historical review or in-depth exegetical defense. Liberal views were opposed by evangelical scholars such as Bernard Ramm. The most recent exchange was by Paul H. Seeley and Robert C. Newman. Within Adventist circles, the idea of a naive Hebrew cosmology has been supported by Richard L. Hamill and others. And if you're wondering, God, sky, and land appears in footnote 60. Now, at this point, I'm going to break from that because we can't get out through all of it in one go-round. And I'm going to give you my take, and then you guys can take off with it. I agree with the major outlines of Younker's and Davidson's paper. The book God, Sky, and Land asks us to put away our preconceived opinions and allow the authors to put their ideas in place of our opinions, under the guise of allow the Bible to speak to us. This is without the authors being Hebrew scholars and without the benefit of word studies or other ways of them knowing for themselves what the ancient Hebrews actually believed. They are merely repeating what they've learned in graduate school with insufficient critical reflection from students of highly biased individuals who were demonstrably wrong. This is a quote that argues that the process they're using is flawed, shall we say. Every human being created in the image of God is endowed with the power akin to that of the Creator. Individuality, power to think and to do. The men in whom this power is developed are the men who bear responsibilities, who are leaders in enterprise, and who influence character. It is the work of true education to develop this power, to train the youth to be thinkers and not mere reflectors of other men's thoughts. That is, you're not supposed to get all of your ideas from graduate school. You're supposed to challenge, criticize. Instead of confining their study to that which men have said or written, let students be directed to the sources of truth, to the vast fields open for research in nature and revelation. And I would add, in this particular case, in the history of Western thought, for themselves, without filters put on them by somebody else. Let them contemplate the great facts of duty and destiny, and the mind will expand and strengthen. Instead of educated weaklings, institutions of learning may send forth men strong to think and to act, men who are masters and not slaves of circumstances, men who possess breadth of mind, clearness of thought, and the courage of their convictions. And that, of course, is from the book Education. Now, some would direct this kind of critical attitude at the church. And in a certain sense, I would agree. The church needs to be constantly looked at as, is it basing what it believes upon another authority? But I think that it is even more importantly directed at the world. The argument everybody knows is a really weak argument. When I started teaching advanced cardiac life support, we were giving 2 amps of sodium bicarbonate at the beginning of every resuscitation. And then they said, well, you really only need 1. And then they said, well, you probably don't need any. And that's the way it's been. Because more evidence has come through, we have found out that we were wrong. Everything we do in advanced cardiac life support, everything we do in medicine, and I would argue everything we do in theology and history needs to be examined critically, including the stuff they teach in graduate school. And for people to have just swallowed that stuff and then spit it out and expect you to believe it, they're trying to turn you into the kind of people that they were, which is reflectors of other men's thoughts and not thinkers. I think we have the obligation to question authority, and especially man-made authority. But that's my opinion now. It's your turn. Sure. Go ahead.
Probably a technical question. Did Younker and Davidson not refer to Andrew Dickinson White and
that was on one of the slides where it mentioned that those were the 2 people who really kind of firmed it up.
Because they were tremendously influential in spreading this story.
Oh, yes.
Draper,
Yeah.
and
they had an axe to grind. They were biased, there's no question. Now, that doesn't mean that they're automatically wrong, but it does mean that it is fair to say, and how do you know?
their books are extremely popular.
Yes, they were. And see, it came from Andrew Dixon White to the people who studied under them or the people who were influenced by them to people who are influenced by them, and by the time you get down to people of our denomination and other denominations who went to graduate school and were told, but everybody knows this. And the question is, how do they know it?
Might be interesting.
See, but when I started medical school, everybody knew that you needed to give bicarbonate for. Well, how did they know it? They didn't. There was a theoretical reason why it might be the case. As it turns out, it didn't work.
It might be of interest to the group here to know that in the early years of the argument within Adventism about the validity of creation accounts, Andrew Dickinson White's books, well, 2-volume book, I guess, whichever way you like to look at it, were strongly being promoted as authorities.
Yes, because the people who went to graduate school were told, this is the way it is, you need to read this book. And White's book has all kinds of footnotes and all kinds of stuff like that. But if you go back and look at what the footnotes say, he doesn't really understand his topic. And wherever he could understand it 2 or 3 ways, he tends to take the most skeptical understanding of it. That is to say, he was biased.
And that was a time when it wasn't so easy to insert footnotes in your papers.
That's true. That's true. It was really tough. But he knew that if he just said whatever, he would wind up with, like Draper, who wasn't of quite as much influence, because Draper just sounded like a rant. White sounded like a scholarly rant.
I don't know if anyone has followed it on the news, but recently scientists have been studying a mechanical computer that was found at the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea. It was made by the Greeks, like at 60 BC, and it was a computer that was used to figure out when eclipses would occur or when certain planets would be seen in the sky. And the interesting thing is that this could only be made if the mathematicians or people, the individuals that made that mechanical computer, had some concept that the world was round and that the herbs that went around the sky had a orbit. So it's kind of interesting that the ancients, at least segments of the ancients, believed in the way that planets are accommodated around the sun the way we do today. So this it's just interesting to note that the way we think today is not really that new.
Yeah. Now, to be fair to the ancients, the moon does orbit around the Earth. And for purposes of figuring things out, the sun can be considered to be orbiting the Earth. And those are relatively simple orbits. And they're close to circular. And in fact, when Kepler was trying to figure out the Earth's orbit around the sun, he was unable to distinguish it from a circle. The difference between a circle and an ellipse was not that great. He had to go to the orbit of Mars before he could say definitively that it was not a circle, that it had to be an ellipse. Of course, you know, if you can't see the moons on Jupiter, then you don't realize that the other bodies could be the center of an orbit. And interestingly, Tycho Brahe still saved the appearances by having the Earth orbit the Sun and having the other planets orbiting the Sun, which is orbiting the Earth, and so you would get the same appearance. But mathematically, there's no significant difference between Tycho Brahe's scheme and that of Copernicus. And as a matter of fact, if you allow elliptical orbits, you can use Tycho Brahe's scheme as something that will get you there to multiple significant figures. In other words, it's not really distinguishable from what we in modern days believe. The major reasons why we believe that the Earth turns has to do with us being able to notice subtle effects that the Earth turning has on us. Things that wouldn't necessarily be known to the ancients, such as if you fire an artillery shell, you have to calculate for the Earth's turning in the meantime if you want to find out exactly where it goes. And, you know, for short distances, it doesn't matter. But for, you know, if you're starting to fire at 16 miles, then it does matter quite a bit. And the same thing is true for the pendulum effect and for gyroscope effects. Very slow, but they're relatively easily seen. And in fact, I've seen a pendulum that we came back an hour later, and sure enough, it had moved over 1/24 of a rotation. But those are subtle effects, and it's very interesting because we have some of the arguments that people use for arguing that the Earth is round, and also that the Earth doesn't move. And that the Earth doesn't move has to do with the idea that, well, if the Earth moved, then wouldn't the air go whistling by? If you drop something, it should move off. And so the concept of relative inertia was one that they hadn't really worked out.
We can get into the deeper question of what motivates this. Is it just pure scholarship? Why devote so much of your life to destroying the Bible? It's a delicate question, but I think one that we need to think about at times.
Well, Andrew Dixon White and John Draper were both considered to be, I think the proper phrase is anti-clerical. And they were also skeptics of God's intervention in history. And of course, creation would be a major intervention in history. And evolution was being viewed as a history where God wasn't having to intervene, and therefore was approving. And so they are, if I can put it this way, they're lawyers and not scientists. That is, they know which direction they're trying to move you, and they'll use whatever arguments look good enough to them and that you'll believe. And the criterion is not what is really the truth here. The criterion is what will move people to believe what I know ahead of time already. And once you let go of, I'm going to stay at the truth at all costs, and you go with, I want something that I can feel comfortable with, then you can do all kinds of shadings, sometimes without realizing it.
We fail to understand other people's motives, but you raise the question. We can say, well, the liberals don't understand the conservatives, and conservatives don't understand the liberals. I mean, this is becoming very obvious in our political picture, which is so humbling, recently at least.
But it's true, the theological picture as well.
But we can understand to a certain extent. Well, let me put it this way. When Christ said, forgive them for they know not what they do, the Roman soldiers and so on crucified him. This was a very true statement, I think, of course, coming from Christ.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't know what they were doing. We get into these modes and we don't know what we're doing. And this can be on both sides. This is a two-edged sword that we need to keep in mind. But I wonder at times if our intellectual pride doesn't get the best of us here, and so we sit and do it our whole life to destroying faith in the Bible, which is the best source we have of information about God and about forgiveness and about eternal life and so on. I have difficulty putting that picture together, but there's something going on here.
Well, I'm reminded of one of my teachers who was a psychiatrist and dealt with people who would move sometimes between paranoid schizophrenia and relatively normal thinking. And he said he remembers one person distinctly who thought he was Napoleon some of the time, and some of the time not. And he remembers talking to the guy, and kind of there came a point where he was starting to realize that maybe he wasn't Napoleon, but it was so much nicer to be Napoleon. And this is the kind of thing that we can do to ourselves quite easily, is, get to the point where we're starting to realize that, the myths that we've told ourselves aren't true. And yet, but if we go that way, we're going to find out that there's a whole bunch of other things we're going to have to change too. And it's so much nicer to just stay where we are. We had this nice, neat little picture. Don't let it get wrecked by... someone once said that science is the tragedy of a beautiful theory slain by an ugly fact. I would maintain that the real tragedy of science is a beautiful theory that survives in spite of several ugly facts.
There is no question that there is a bias in the scientific attitude of, the last 2 centuries actually, certainly the last century and a half. Science, you can speculate about anything you want to, all kinds of orbits, universes beyond ours and so on, how life originated and all so on. But you can't speculate about God. That's out of the picture. This is a tremendous bias against truth. What if God exists? How are you going to find truth when you start excluding certain ideas? Very prominent ideas, incidentally.
Yeah.
I think when you look at the total picture, I still feel fairly secure that the Bible and nature provide us with the best information, and truth ought to make more sense than error, and admit that model makes more sense.
Yeah. Now, one of the things I think that's interesting about this whole thing is that I think last week we didn't really have a lot of pushback after the argument that the ancient Hebrews, whatever they believed, did not believe in a solid dome with a flat earth over it. And I found that extremely instructive. And what I see it is the last little bit of a myth that's being hung on to. The first part of the myth was, the Christian church believed in the flat earth and the solid dome until we get to the Middle Ages, and Galileo finally dispelled that. Which, of course, is total balderdash, but which was popularized by Draper and White. But that was part of the myth, you see. You started with the ancient Hebrews, and then we kept it on until we got to the scientific age, and then we had to give it up. Well, as we found out, it really wasn't true during the Christian period at all. You can't find more than about 2 people in the entire range, and they're the 2 that are always brought up. Interestingly enough, the same thing happens with Augustine, who didn't believe in a 6-day creation. He and Origen are the only 2 people that ever make that case. And interestingly, they make the case for an instant creation. But you see, if you're not trying to be fair to the breadth of Christianity, then this is what you do. You pick out the people who agreed with you and you trumpet them as the real Christian position. And the same thing. There's been a total collapse of the idea of the flat Earth during the Middle Ages. Total collapse. Everybody knew it was round. And by everybody, I don't mean to reverse their thing and say, well, everybody knew it was flat. I mean to say Thomas Aquinas, Augustine, Basil, you name it. Everybody who speaks about it assumes that the Earth is round. And then you get to so that part of the myth has collapsed completely now in careful academic circles. It's still kept alive by some people who don't want to let go of it, but it's pretty much trashed by the scholars in the area, and for good reason. But the ancient Hebrews myth lives on, and they try to sever the two of them, not realizing that they were part of the exact same movement. And so what you're seeing is the tail end. People believing, well, maybe they were wrong about this, but they were at least right about the Hebrews. In ignoring the word hug, which means circle, and if you apply it to the heavens, then you have to apply it to the earth as sphere instead, which is probably a fair thing to do, in which case the earth is a sphere as well as the heavens. And even more interesting, which I didn't bring up last week, but there is the text that talks about that God hangeth the earth upon nothing. And so now you have a semi-complete, sparse in terms of the number of texts that refer to it, but in terms of the texts that refer to the Earth's structure, you've got a good argument that at least some of the biblical writers believed in a spherical Earth sitting there in the middle of whatever, with no support underneath it. And that's the closest thing we have to a biblical cosmology. But that's way too advanced for the people who want to make the ancient Hebrews look out to be dummies so that they can ignore what else they wrote.
But last century, it's not just the ancient Hebrews who suffered, but the Bible as a whole, because of the idea, that people who the Bible teaches a flat Earth.
Yeah.
And I understand this is being alleviated. You don't find it in all the encyclopedias anymore, and so on. That
but this
are
is
waking
the
up to
crazy
the
thing.
idea that was a wrong concept.
Yeah. If you go to graduate school, you'll probably still hear some of this stuff. It's left over. It's the same kind of leftovers that happened to me when I was taking residency in internal medicine. We taught stuff, or they taught stuff, and we were supposed to learn it because. And a good example is rotating tourniquets. And somebody finally tested that out and found out it didn't make a bit of difference. If anything, it was worse for the patient than nothing. And it has now been completely trashed. But there are a lot of things that were, they're leftovers. My resident taught me, whose resident taught him, whose resident taught him, whose resident taught him, and so forth on down the line. I'm being male-centered, I know that. But back when I was there, why male-centrism was a fact of life.
And how many of these concepts that we think are true now are going to be proved wrong later on?
Maybe more than we think. And with that, I think we need to be really careful. I mean, if you're going to question the biblical record, and I'm not saying you shouldn't necessarily, but I am saying that if you're going to do it, you better question the questioners as well. I think that was the mistake that Eve made, is that, once somebody starts raising the question of trust, then the question of why should I trust the person who's raising that question has to come up. And at that point, I think you back off a little bit and you start thinking very, very carefully. Anyway, next week we'll go into what the Bible actually says, and I'll be adding a few things at the end, and then a week after we'll discuss where the controversy, in my opinion, really should be.